A reading from the 7th chapter of Amos. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid to waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from this land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there, and prophesy there. But never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Then Amos answered Amaziah, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, go, prophesy to my people Israel. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Good morning, Wilshire. Good morning, room of people I don't know at all. Thank you for having me here. This is not my first time to stand here. I was here a few years ago for the Baptist Women in Ministry annual gathering. Missed the one last week, but I'm happy to be here again. So grateful for you to welcome me in your sacred space this morning. And as we step into this moment, this teaching moment together, I want to extend an invitation via an urgent reminder for the times that we live in. It is this: listen. Want to get better at holding multiple truths at once? Listen. Want to recover from always reacting? Listen. Want to know peace that surpasses all understanding? Listen. Want to move in groundedness, in choice, and in action? Listen. Want to understand people more and dehumanize less? Want to make sense of things you don't get? Want to be someone who is less afraid? Want to be an always learning person of faith? Want to create bigger and wider tables? Want to be more than you thought you were able? Listen. 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 Practice listening. Begin in nature. Take your cues from the earth. Befriend creation. Then take what you've learned to the people around you. Extra credit to those willing to center those most vulnerable. Listen. Amaziah told Amos, go away, seer. Go back to where you came from. Do your prophesying there. And Amos said, I'm no prophet. I'm not even the disciple of a prophet. I'm just a person listening. See, at first glance, our sermon text for today may feel a bit antiquated. I don't know if you were keeping up. Maybe it's one of those texts you skimmed briefly way back when, eyes glazed over when you were trying to read the Bible in a year. Or maybe it's just one of those texts that you try not to confront altogether, because if you did that, you'd actually have to try and make sense of it. But I think this reading today is timely. I think it's even relevant, because I believe that deep in the heart of today's First Testament lectionary reading is a story about listening. And hey, doesn't listening feel a bit like a forgotten art these days? So, Amaziah says to Amos, "Go away, seer," or "Go away, prophet. We want no more prophesying here. This is the royal sanctuary, the national temple." Amaziah holds the highest religious position in the nation. So he personifies the state of what Israel has become in today's reading when he explicitly says that he doesn't intend to listen, not to Amos, and by extension, not to God. Amaziah, the mouthpiece of the religious institution, not listening, but also the king, representing empire, and the people, Israel, indifferent and unconcerned with the poor and powerless among them. None of these people were interested in listening. But the prophet who insisted he wasn't a prophet was listening, and Amos provides a contrast to the others in this narrative, and it can be of interest to us today. When Amaziah says, "Go away from," Amos counters with, "Go," God says, "Go to." And though Amaziah portrays important status as the high priest of the most prominent temple in Israel, Amos lowers himself even below the title he is given, calling himself only a herdsman, a dresser of sycamore trees. While Amaziah preaches a message of greatness via human power, Amos preaches a divine message of goodness, so compelling he leaves his job. He leaves his security. He leaves his home for the sake of it. The text is telling us that listening is essential, but it's also telling us that listening is risky business. And yet, listening may very well be one of our most powerful and useful spiritual practices. And I'm saying to you and to me, don't sleep on it. Don't sleep on listening, because listening could build bridges even now. Listening could be a coping mechanism. Yes, even now. Listening could become our superpower, our liberation primer, our thoughtful response, a sacred offering in these wild times. So then, why do so few of us prioritize listening? Perhaps, as Amos shows in today's reading, it is because consistently and authentically, actually listening, involves a great deal of risk. What happens when you listen enough to risk changing? When you listen enough to risk movement? When you listen enough to risk shifting, evolving? Here's what happens: inner upheaval, relational upheaval, and yes, societal and political upheaval. Think about it. When we radically listen to people, when we step out of our contexts, our various echo chambers, our social media confrontations, and genuinely listen to people's stories and experiences, we cannot help but begin to humanize them a bit more. Don't you think we need more of that? Do things like compassion and empathy become easier to access when we stop and listen to those who have us most perplexed? Or how does listening to the groans of the earth shape how we then treat it? Does it challenge our habits and our daily rhythms? Does it challenge our postures, the choices we make? Does it influence how we exist in this world? Or how might our listening to God via our various spiritual disciplines and practices compel us toward the work of heaven on earth? How might our daily commitment to our inner landscape jolt us out of a status quo experience and into the fullness of our God-given image embodied? When we prioritize divine listening, when we allow it the place it deserves in our lives, then we begin to see God's handprint on all of creation, and we can't unsee it. We begin to recognize our own complicity in unjust systems, and we become better equipped to move in this awareness. And we begin to notice the many spirit promptings beckoning us, nudging us in the direction of heaven on earth change. Listening will call us to action. And this is enough to give many people pause because the disruption here is great. But keep at it. Keep listening, because this is just the entry point. Listening also helps us to remember, because these awakenings that we experience when we listen are not meant to lead us into shame and guilt and self-loathing. We may experience some of these things along the way, but we do not set up shop here and make it our home. If you have, keep listening. Keep doing the work of remembering, because it will lead you, eyes wide open, right to the doorstep of your own inherent goodness. Here, we are reminded that we are children of God, divinity, spirit in us, our birthright, and God's own image imprinted on our lives. Each of us, we are made in the image of God, and spirit is at work within us. And listening regularly helps us remember this foundational truth, making listening a most sacred and holy practice. When Amos remembers, he goes back to his roots, what he knows to be true about him, what he knows to have been a valid word from God to him, despite any religious leader, Amaziah, who says otherwise. Still, Amos stops short at calling himself a prophet. And yet, hey, if it looks like a prophet and sounds like a prophet and functions like a prophet, it might be a prophet. And I'm just saying, thank God for this, because then and now this is true. It is not the title you are given. It's not the outside permission or authority or validation from anyone else that makes us who we are. But if we are not regularly listening, we are less likely to remember this spirit truth when we need it most. Fun fact about the book of Amos, it is not some rendering of a story that was written once and then thrown into the canon. Considerable editing and tweaking and curation took place here. Some of what Amos originally said was eliminated, some was supplemented for newer audience. There are remarks that were influenced by later commentary. There's fragments of hymnic material. All of this was done with the direct intention of making his message more accessible to later audiences. In other words, Amos's intense, prophetic, passionate words that we read today were actually distilled down many times over to make them more digestible. Why? So that readers and hearers of this word would be more willing to listen. And it makes me think about us and our work of listening today. The kind of listening that I'm talking about will challenge us to go off the scripts we've been given by whatever camp or side we are on. Instead, our listening will prompt us into the liminal and gray spaces, into the mystery, where we become equipped to really engage with the things of faith, like paradox and non-dualism, and mystery and uncertainty. In other words, our practice of listening comes with the expectation that we are people who are doing our own spiritual work. We are not leaving it up to anybody else. Sure, we can learn and be inspired and be led and be supported by others, but we are listening for ourselves. And y'all, this is not the kind of faith posture that can be packaged up and mass-produced. Which is why listening for yourself, thinking for yourself, asking hard questions, challenging inherited paradigms are generally discouraged in a lot of churches and by a lot of faith leaders. We can't be manipulated or shamed into things when we are listening for ourselves. And this is the prophetic posture that I believe we are called to take. It is radically authentic, and the results of it will naturally and inevitably lead to action. The kind of action that goes off script occasionally. The kind of action that is disruptive, resulting in upheaval, inner upheaval, relational upheaval, and yes, societal and political upheaval. Isn't it interesting how all these prophets of the First Testament went out of their comfort zone to deliver messages that were highly unpopular, almost always saying precisely the opposite of the religious leaders at the time, who always seemed to be in cahoots with empire? Sound familiar? Amid all this confusion and lack of genuine leadership, Amos was brave and Amos was obedient. But how did Amos know to speak against the current paradigm? And how can we know if we are being like Amaziah, overly defensive when we should be humbling ourselves and listening? Or if we are like Amos, acting perhaps in defiance to the norm, but out of a true call from God? How do we know? I am saying that progress and change before anything else begins with listening. We have so much going on in our world. We have so much going on in our country right now, so much uncertainty and division and turmoil and distrust. So many people are shouting, constantly reacting. And I want to know who is willing to do some listening. Amos listened. When God spoke to Amos in this text, God shared the imagery of a plumb line. If a wall is out of plumb, it cannot do its job, the job it was designed to do. And so the imagery here is clearly of a people who are not measuring up. I like to think of it in terms of alignment. If we are not in alignment with Spirit, we cannot live into the fullness we were created for as image bearers of God. How do we get out of alignment? We stop listening. But when we are listening for Spirit of God within us, among us, around us, when we embody the truth of Imago Dei, but also extend that belief outward to others, the natural result of all of this is movement. Inner movement, forward movement, prophetic movement. Movement beckoning our hands and feet to action. Movement that shifts the image of heaven and earth closer to reality, shifting us into divine alignment. Now, here's the part where preachers like to give you steps, a blueprint for how to listen, what you should do exactly, a checklist perhaps, or maybe some fill in the blanks. But if you are waiting for a formula this morning, I won't do it. I refuse. Because there isn't one. There is only you and God working within you and Spirit movement directing you toward the kind of listening you need to do in this season, and the same is true for me and for all of us. So I will just ask this. Will you dare to traverse your own inner landscape? Will you dare to dig way down, deep into that basement of your own inner home? Will you reach out and up onto the highest shelf where that old spiritual toolbox lays, containing those dusty tools you might not have used in a while, among them the spiritual practice of listening? Will you shake off that dust and bring listening into the light? Will you give it a place of honor within your consciousness? Will you give it a seat at your table? Will you listen to whatever prompts you are receiving right now? Doubts aside, questions aside, comparison aside, second guessing aside, despite the chaos and the hopelessness and the fear and the valid anxieties of our day, will you practice that forgotten art of listening? I pray it would be so for each of us. May our listening ground us in a prophetic posture. May listening sustain all our liberation work. May listening shape us into resurrection people. May listening resurrect our hope, granting us the energy we need to carry on in these times. Amen.